Welcome back, everyone. On my last video, I shared with you how to stretch canvas, so how to pull canvas over top of a canvas stretcher. And today I would like to share with you a few different options that we have as painters, be it acrylic or oil painters, for surfaces and surface preparation. Um, so I'm going to go through first the different surfaces. I have a couple of examples also that I can show you of what I draw on, what I paint on in my own practice. But first I'll go with the very basics. So you can get products like this. So this one is canvas paper. Canvas paper, personally, I don't have too much use for. It's good for doing little thumbnails or little color studies and such. Um, but I probably would never use this to do a finished painting with. Reason being that the only way to really frame this would be to frame it as you would a drawing, which would be behind glass, or you'd have to mount it on something. And I just don't find that if I was successful in doing a painting on this surface, I would have too many options for displaying it. So for that reason, I generally use this just for sort of doing my thumbnails and doing different color swatches and playing around that way. Another option that a lot of artists tend to go for is this. This is a fiberboard, MDF board, anything like that. The F in MDF, of course, stands for fiberboard. And what this is it's a bunch of wood chips that are glued together. I don't like this too much because it's not archival. It's going to last a few decades, which is great. However, in the long run, your painting won't survive, I would say, beyond 80 years. Not only that, but when these get wet or they get moist, they're very sensitive to water, so they'll blister, they'll move around, etc. What I do like about them is that they stay perfectly flat. And the argument is that if you seal it up on both sides, then it won't be able to get any water on it and it's going to be okay. But as we also know, when you seal everything up and it can't breathe, it deteriorates quicker. So I find that these, while they're again sort of like the canvas paper, they're really good to do little studies on. Long term, they're not too good. Archivally, they're not too good, but they are a lot easier to slap inside of a frame, for example, and have a quick display. What I use if I'm going to work on board are these little pieces of wood. Now this one is a birch wood. You want to make sure that you're not using a wood that has any sap in it. So anything like a pine or a fir tree, those have saps in them and they're going to damage your painting. So you want to make sure with whatever plywood you use that you don't have any sap in it. And secondly, a lot of woods, they're going to sort of warp and stuff. So you don't want anything like that because again, if you put it into a frame, it's going to bow. And so you want something that's going to stay nice and flat. Birch wood is probably the most common one that us artists use to paint on. But I will warn you, I learned this the hard way. When you go into the hardware store and you get birch wood, quite often if it's just regular birch wood, they're only using birch on the exterior layers, and on the inside they're using something like an aspen. And the aspen, it's going to bow. It's not a high quality. It's not of the same quality as the birch wood. But if you buy Baltic birch, then you're okay. Then that's pure birch. And you can get as low as, 1/8 and 1/4. So you can use these really thin boards and they're not going to bow or anything. And then also they're really easy to frame. These ones I love because I'm able to use them when I go landscape painting or field painting. And I have my little box here. I have a couple different sizes of boxes, but these, especially when you're an oil painter, you want something like this where your panel can just fit inside there. And of course you can put the lid back on. I can put up to 4 different panels back to back here and they can all be wet. And usually I'm transporting these between Mexico and Canada and I put them in my luggage and I take them home and they might still be wet, they might be dry, but they stay nice and safe when they're inside my little box here. So I like the panels for that reason when I'm field painting, but I insist that it has to be birch. And of course we also know about canvases. It's probably the most common thing that artists work on. You can get canvas boards, which are, I don't know if they use a fiberboard or a cardboard, but they're stretching canvas over top of a hard surface like this. You're not going to find any of those in my studio simply because they warp all the time and they're the most frustrating things. But some artists prefer them over any type of board because you get the texture of the canvas, right? So you get a little bit of texture on the surface. Some artists really like that. Me, I like it sometimes. It depends completely on the project I'm working on. But for example, Diego Velázquez, best painter to ever live, is a court painter, 17th century Spain. What he would do is with the canvas, he would paint it whatever the local given color is, and then he would take his brush and he would scumble it over top of the canvas. So all those weaves, he would sort of hit the peak of each weave, and you get this shimmering effect of light sort of playing on the surface. So there's some artists who have techniques like that where the texture is really imperative, and some are even working with a heavy canvas like a burlap so they can get that really coarse weave, if that's what they're into for their applications. So canvases, stretch canvases, on the one hand you can make your own canvas, your stretcher to put the canvas over top of, and hopefully if the weather improves I'll be able to do a demo on that when I pull out my power tools. But if you don't have access to power tools, you can go to your art supply store and you can get these prefabricated canvas stretcher bars. And so you can see, they have these sort of joints. They just snap together on a 45 and you put a couple of staples in there and you're good. And they of course have this bevel, which is really imperative so that your canvas sort of just floats above this. So these are really good, especially if you want unorthodox sizes, right? So you could take something like this, which looks like maybe it's a 24 inch, and you could couple it with a 6 inch, right? And maybe you have a really long panoramic one, etc. Sizes that you otherwise couldn't buy in the art supply store. If you do go with something like this, I would urge you to go with the thick profile. So this one's a thick profile, right? So when it's sitting on the wall, this is how far it will come off. If you go with the thin ones, they have a tendency to sort of warp a little bit, especially if you live in a climate that has, it's dry and it's wet and it's dry and it's wet. The wood is going to sort of move to that. So for that reason, I like these girthy ones. Not only that, but when you put them together and put the canvas over top, you don't have to frame them. You can just paint the side and it's presentable, and your client could decide to frame it or not to frame it, but you're able to put it on a wall right away. So I brought an example of a stretcher that I stretched. So I just used again, scrap pieces of wood that I have from plywood, and I put this one together. So we can see it's sort of floating. So unlike the other options, canvas board, or any board for that matter, it has some give to it, right? It's flexible. This one's solid. So it depends on the artist, what they're looking for, and also the type of brushwork that you make. Some people like the smooth surface because they can pull it out, and they like for it to be really solid because maybe they're really aggressive, palette knife, etc. So I just say experiment with the different options and see which one suits you the best. But not only that, keep all the options available so that if you have a given application that you want, you're knowledgeable and you're familiar with the different surfaces to help you achieve that application. So this is stretch canvas. So you can buy the stretcher bars at your art supply store, and you also have to buy the actual canvas there. Canvas, it's usually sold on the roll. I personally buy the roll. It's an investment of a few $100s, but you only have to do it once every couple of years. So I buy it on the roll, but usually it's sold by the linear foot on a 4, 6, 8, 10 foot roll, something like that. And the prices are going to change depending on the ounce, so how heavy the canvas is. I always buy pretty heavy canvas because I go big, and if I go small, it's no harm in having a heavier canvas rather than a lighter one. All right, so those are a few different applications, a few different surfaces rather. And now once you have your surface, it's really important that you prime it, because if paint is to go on top of this, the oil paint, not so much acrylic, but oil paint, it's going to deteriorate the material. it's gonna make this wood fall apart a lot quicker. Same thing with wood. If you note it with my wood panel, it was white. That's because I had already primed it, so I had gotten it ready. So you want, especially for us oil painters, you want some sort of a barrier here. So when you work on top of it, the oil doesn't touch this surface. But having said that, for some artists, maybe the difference between your painting lasting 80 years or 300 years, you don't really care. And that's fine too, right? Because sometimes we get bogged down with these materials the right way, the wrong way. So everyone gets to consider it for themselves. So the most common way of priming a surface is gesso. So gesso is a water-based latex or acrylic paint with titanium white in it. And it also, what makes it different than an acrylic paint is that it has chalk in it. And chalk is porous. So when you put your gesso down, you're sort of putting down a layer that's going to be porous. So then when you put your oil or your acrylic, it's going to bond a lot better. So this is what just about every artist uses now. Traditionally, artists would use rabbit skins glue. Some artists still use it, especially in caustic painters. And it is just that. It's rabbit skin and some bones and some other really gnarly stuff that if you don't have to get into, I would say don't get into it. I've done it a few times. You got to heat it up. You got to cool it off. You got to reheat it. And your studio is just going to stink. And you have to do the double boiler. And it's a 24-hour process because you have to let it cool down and make sure the consistency's right, and then go back into it and heat it up and apply it. And then on top of that, you have to put down a ground color, so like a lead white or something, over top of the rabbit skins glue. We've evolved enough in the painting world that most people find the gesso is the best product. Gesso, there's a ton of different companies that make it. I find Golden makes by far the best one. Some companies, it's too liquidy, there's too much water in it. Other companies, it's too thick. I find the consistency with Golden is absolutely the best. The other manufacturer that's pretty common, a bit more of a budget option, is Liquitex. And I just thought I'd bring this one to show you because it's a clear gesso. And so I know for some artists, when you see this wood, you think, well, that would make a really great ground color. And it will. However, you got to create some sort of a barrier here. So the clear gesso is a nice way of creating a barrier and still being able to maintain some of this brown. I will warn you, however, it does go a little bit frosty. So it's not 100% transparent. It will be a little bit frosty, but you're still going to get that brown come through. So it's a nice option. Gesso, I don't know if Golden does, but I know some of the other companies, they make black, they make color gesso, etc. I have heard of some artists tinting their gesso, so putting color in there so that it's a little bit closer to the ground color. I like to just work on the white and then get right into it. So those are the different ways that we prime our surface. Now when you're priming it, I'm going to do a demo, but generally artists use a brush, a paintbrush to apply the gesso. But I'm going to also show you a technique that I use where I both brush it on and I trowel it on. Why do I trowel it on? Because I like the harder surface. Before I get into that, I'm going to show a few different examples here of surfaces that I work on, because I do work on traditional canvas with oil paint, etc. But because I'm a multimedia artist, I like to sort of play around with different surfaces. And as was noted, I have, I do think about the longevity, the archival quality, etc. So this large one here, this one's a drawing with oil paint over top of it, and it's on board, right? So we can hear that. I really like the gesso, and we can see the back of it here. I've just sort of framed it up a little bit with the wood. I like the gesso, so I'll prime the board with gesso, because I find that gesso, because it has the chalk in it, it really emulates a drawing surface, and it's really great to work on with charcoal. And this series was sort of part where I had an objective of bridging the drawing and the painting, because for a lot of us, we do these preliminary drawings and they turn out really great, and then we paint over it and we lose all that. So I was exploring and looking at different ways that I could keep the drawing underneath, keep some of that freshness and the quickness, and then be able to paint the oil over top. So I worked with the charcoal you know, got all my very gestural sort of line work and the energy and stuff that we love charcoal for. And then I used a spray fixative. I locked that in, and then I painted directly over top of it. I have in the past also added the layer of putting a clear gesso over top of the charcoal and then painting, whereas this one I just went with a spray fixative because there were a few areas where the oil paint was picking up the charcoal a little bit, and in this case I was okay with that. But I did want to make sure that I retained all this line work and then also had the opportunity to sort of get in there, you know, and get some really good description with the oil paint. So there's one example of how I'm using a surface and a range of materials and working it so that is both archival, super stable, but gives me everything I need. So this one's very similar. This one's so far just a drawing. Same sort of approach, right? I've built this frame for it and it's mounted on there. And then I always, after I've put the plywood on, I take my router and I put it around there so I get this sort of smooth edge so it's, you know, I don't chip the wood or anything. And in this case, I've adhered a sheet of cotton rag paper onto it. So I have paper over top of the wood. And so what I did is I used a clear, like, what do you call it? Acrylic medium. That's right. So clear acrylic medium. I used the heavy medium, golden product again, and I brushed that on. I like the heavy because it doesn't have a whole lot of water, but you get something pretty thick. I put the paper on top, and then I put a whole bunch of weights, you know, another sheet of plywood and some weights, and then I come back to it the next day and it's dried, and this has adhered to that surface. So now I have a drawing surface that's on top of wood. That is archival, and I'm not going to have to worry about framing it because I did do a really large drawing, was it 3 years ago? And then I took it to the framer and it was all oversized. So I ended up having to pay a lot of money to get that framed. So I've since learned it's better to mount your paper first, and then you have, you know, something that is presentable that I can put on the wall. I did do another drawing. I don't have it in this studio. Where I drew like this over top of the paper, and then I spray fixative, and then I put the clear acrylic, and then I paint it with oil. So, and that might happen with this one. So this one I might go back into with oil. I might do like an oil glaze just to get sort of a color in there. So I'll mix, you know, my drawing, my painting. I really don't have too many parameters, and of course I'll work with collage and everything like that. So there's two examples of different sort of unorthodox ways of working and different surfaces that I use, but still keeping with the general foundation of surface application and a mind towards archival quality. So I have the canvas that I stretched on the previous video out. It's a pretty large one, and again I'm using the Gesso made by Golden, and I'm just using a house painter's brush. Now I'm going to be showing you a special technique by where I use a trowel to get a really smooth surface. But your first layer, you should brush it on because we want to be able to get full coverage before speeding ahead and troweling it. Because if I trowel it, then I won't get the peaks of the weave. So I want to make sure that I get a nice good seal. If you're not using a trowel and you're only going to be brushing this on, you're probably looking at 2 or 3 coats depending on the product that you're using. With Golden, because it is such a good product and it has a good consistency, you're only going to have to put 2 coats on. But if you're using the Liquitex, it's a little bit more runny. You're probably going to need 3. And some artists do like the more runny, sort of watered down gesso because it's going to tighten up your canvas a little bit. But I also find that that can be a little bit dangerous because I have stretched my canvas so tight and had water in my gesso that when it tightened up, it made my 45s, all my corners, start to come loose. So it tightened it too much. So you want to be mindful of that. And if you are just going to be brushing it on, you can see that for my first coat, I'm going one direction, right? And then I would let that dry, sand it, And then when I brushed my second coat on, I would go the opposite direction. So I would go this way to sort of emulate the weave of the canvas. That way my hills and valleys aren't getting too big or developing too much texture. Alright, so I have given my canvas about 1 hour to dry, so it's nice and dry now. All the gesso's dry, first coat. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to sand it down very lightly. This one is a 320 grit sandpaper. It can be a bit more coarse than that, but you don't want to go super coarse because you're not lifting per se. You're just sort of knocking some of the heads off and smoothing it out so that your next layer doesn't get hung up. This is some light sanding, and you probably noted at the end of the last video that I also did the sides. I like to do the sides on the first go around, sort of get that over with. And on the sides, I only do one coat of the gesso. I don't waste it. Yeah, so that's sort of good enough. So like I said, I'm going to demonstrate for you a different technique that I use, which is troweling out the gesso. Normally, I have sort of a metal type trowel or a tin trowel that house painters use for edging. And I like that because I can soften the corners. But what I'm using instead is just a stir stick, and I've sanded down the corners. These are a lot better than, for example, your plaster trowel, something like this. That might be a little bit too heavy-handed. So I'm going to be using this piece of wood. Having said that, some people, they like sort of sharper edges, and that might be something that you like. So having a traditional sort of plastering trowel might work for you, because you will get some sort of edges with this application. And I'm just using an old can to apply the gesso from the big bucket here. I'll just sort of leave it upside down there. So I start at one end, and you can see I'm just sort of dragging it out. Not worried about it being too consistent right away, getting a general to specific type application, but I do want to make sure that I go edge to edge so that I don't have areas that are super textural versus areas that are really smooth. And I'm going to only do one coat, but I have been knowing, if I need my surface to be really, really smooth, I can do upwards of 4 coats with this method, and I'll get something that's quite close to painting on a board. So I can build this up a whole lot and emulate the MDF board or the wood of the panel. I'd done years ago a painting of a spider plant, and of course the leaves, they pull out quite nicely. So I want to make sure that I had a surface that was conducive to that sort of paintbrush application, where I could really pull out my brushwork and drag them. So here I pretty much have edge to edge, so I do a nice pull sort of right across, and then I move to my next section, because this is going to dry as I'm working, so I don't want to overwork it, because then I end up working sort of wet over dry and I get lips that I'm not too happy with. So I'm just going to keep going, work from here all the way down, pull it out, and just refill the gesso on the surface as needed. All right, so my surface is dry now. It's got 2 coats of gesso, the first with a brush, the second with the trowel. And now all I need to do is sand it quickly. And again, with the same grit of sandpaper, nice and light. And then I'm good to paint. It's nice and taut. It's going to be stable, etc. I have a few lines in there. Don't mind them too much. Again, they're just going to add a little bit of texture to the final piece.